اگر تند بادی برآید ز کنج، به خاک افکند نارسیده ترنج. ستمکاره خوانمش ار دادگر، هنرمند گویمش ار بی هنر. اگر مرگ داد است بیداد چیست؟ ز داد این همه بانگ و فریاد چیست؟ از این راز جان تو آگاه نیست، بدین پرده اندر تو را راه نیست. همه تا در آز رفته فراز، به کس بر نشد این در راز باز. برفتن مگر بهتر آیدت جای، چو آرام گیری به دیگر سرای.
These are the words contained within the greatest Iranian poem, the Shahnameh, one of the longest epic works of literature. It has for the last 1,000 years captivated audiences with tales of love and war. My name is Rostam, and ever since I was a boy, I've had a fascination with the elusive Shahnameh, which used to sit on the top shelf of my parents' bookcase. But tonight, it will remain elusive no longer. Tonight, I would like to introduce you to its author, Ferdowsi. His name is recognized across Iran, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. Shahnameh manuscripts are some of the most beautiful in the world, commissioned by kings throughout the ages. Thousands of pilgrims every year make trips to Ferdowsi's mausoleum. His timeless brand of wisdom draws me to him all these years later. Of course, Shahnameh itself literally translates to Legend of Kings, and details the history of the Iranians and their greatest heroes, both real and fictional. The Iranians of antiquity had been making these legendary books for a while, but in the 10th century, 4 years after the fall of the last pre-Islamic dynasty, the myths were in danger of being lost. A new Shahnameh was itching to be born. Normally, these kinds of books are crafted by a large team of royal scholars, but it's ironic that the greatest Shahnameh comes from such a humble origin. And yet, the life of its author still remains largely a mystery. Please join me in discovering it together, line by line. Our journey begins in the city of Tus, a hub of culture and commerce in eastern Iran. Tus was a stop between important trade routes that extended China to Rome along the Silk Road. Ferdowsi is theorized to have lived in Tus nearly his whole life. As a boy, he ran through its markets, and as a man, he shopped in them. In fact, by the time he was 30, he had inherited his own estate and settled down with his wife and son. Ferdowsi belonged to the Dehqan social class, groups of local landowners that still held estates, with ancestry to the previous Persian empires. Because of this, his parents made sure he had books, and he read brand new works from big authors of that time. He was constantly surrounded by the stories of the great heroes and kings of Iran. Dehqan narrated these tales fondly, even as he began to fade from popular culture. As a lover of words, Ferdowsi's frequent company were other literati, like Mansour, the governor of the city of Tus, and Dagheri, a famous court poet. Ferdowsi, in particular, loved and envied Dagheri, whose work made Ferdowsi's own writing look amateur. In their teenage years, Mansour's father commissioned the Shahnameh Abu Mansuri, a history that trumped all others. Crafted by scribes from the most authentic sources, the book was a complete prose Iranian history. There's no doubt Ferdowsi and his friends spent hours flipping through its pages. Maybe Ferdowsi imagined a world where everyone appreciated the old legends, not just him and his bookworm friends. Dagheri, in particular, was so moved in fact by this work that he planned a master poem adapted from the Shahnameh Abu Mansuri. This was an opportunity to help others see the beauty in the book he saw. Words could be written, but only poetry could be recited, memorized, and sung. After weeks and weeks of begging the king, along with most of his own personal wealth, Dakhri actually managed to rent the book all to himself. It's possible that Dakhri recognized his friend Ferdowsi's great talent and passions for stories, and urged him to collaborate. But Ferdowsi refused. How could he write alongside a master such as Dakhri? He was ashamed to even read his own work in front of him. And how would he even support himself? As for the stories themselves, they were the tales of infidels now. Dismayed, Dakhri started without him, but he knew his friend would come around eventually. And so life continued on as normal. Ferdowsi forgot all about Dakhri's little Shahnameh project. But weeks later, bad news reached him. Only 1,000 lines in, Dakhri was murdered, stabbed to death, sitting at his desk. For the rest of his life, Ferdowsi never got over the sudden loss of his best friend. He sank into a deep depression. Not even the faces of his wife or child could bring him joy. One night, Ferdowsi awoke from a nightmare. To comfort him, his wife sets out fruit and wine. Drink up your wine, and as you do, so I will tell a story from the days gone by. A story full of love and trickery, whose hero lived for war and chivalry. Sweet moon, I said, my cypress, my delight, tell me this tale to while away the night. First, listen well, she said, and when you've heard the story through, record it, word for word. What if he could get that book? What if he could get a patron, one with enough money to support him, to finish the dream that his dear friend had started? However, the foundational text, the Shahnameh Abu Mansuri, was given back to the king, far from Tus. Eastern Iran crawled with deserting soldiers, looking for easy scores, and steppe nomads that frequently raided the countryside. Alone, he would not make it very far. But, although he lacked resources and confidence, he did have one thing: friends. Mansour, Ferdowsi's longtime friend, who may have read the little writing experiments, promised he'd get a copy of the Shahnameh Abu Mansuri for Ferdowsi. Mansour also provided for all his financial needs. Ferdowsi writes this about him: a lord of counsel and modesty, to hear whose gentle accents was my joy, said unto me, what means can I employ to make thee give thy life to poetry? I will do all and hide thy poverty. He said, this book of kings, Nameh Shahriar, if 'tis thy fate, to great kings dedicate. Now truly, Ferdowsi had no excuse. His destiny had caught up with him, and he of all people knew that no one can outrun their fate. He went much further than a prose history, transforming heroes from stone reliefs into living beings. Mansour came by regularly, despite his great political plans, and Ferdowsi read to him, the two revising the stories together. Mansour was simply happy to see his friend so alive after Dakhri's death. Ferdowsi pledged to dedicate the book to him, for not only was he a good friend, but a good patron as well. In 986, as Ferdowsi was finishing the first edition, Mansur had to leave for the capital to take an oath of loyalty with the king. Ferdowsi was concerned about the number of soldiers he was taking for what seemed to be a simple loyalty pledge, but Mansur promised him he would be back in time to hear the new draft. Months later, when the poet was 46 years old, that familiar messenger came to his door. Mansur was dead. He had lied about his going to the capital, and instead met the king on the field of battle. Earth seemed vile indeed before him. He was brave and trustworthy, and when he perished, was as in a mead, a lofty cypress, leveled by a gust. I see not race of him alive or dead. By murderous crocodiles his life was sped. But I bethink me to redress this woe, of counsel which to that great prince I owe. He said, "This book of kings, if 'tis thy fate to tell it, then to great kings dedicate." For the next few years, Ferdowsi barely scraped by. His negligence to his estate was losing him money, and he was forced to travel from patron to patron. His son by this time had grown into a young man, but his father had barely witnessed it. He had spent so much time shut in his room, writing useless poetry, while his wife grew ill. It had been years since the death of Mansur, and if his father would not give this ridiculous dream up, then he would. Ferdowsi begged God for a patron, but little did he know his best hope was already making a name for himself. And although the prince would never meet the poet, his legacy would change forever because of him. In the humble town of Ghazni, in eastern Afghanistan, the son of a Turkish slave was quickly becoming the most powerful man in all of the Islamic world. In the 10th century, this was a trend. Since it was illegal for a Muslim to enslave another Muslim, slavery developed on the borders of the empire. Turkish boys were often captured or bought from the Eurasian steppe and given Islamic education and military training. But their heavy reliance ended up backfiring as these Turks accumulated wealth and power, becoming kingmakers in their own right. Mahmoud, the son of a powerful Turkish slave, rose as lord of most of the eastern lands. Challengers were crushed. For a brief moment, there was stability, and in 998, the last king died without an heir. Mahmoud did not pretend. From prince to king, he seized the crown for himself, founding the Ghaznavid Empire. Ferdowsi learned years later of Mahmud's conquests when his troops paraded through the city gates of Tus, and its governors were forced into exile. Despite the uneasy tension, this was an opportunity. Mahmud likened himself as an Iranian sovereign to become closer to his support base. He even went as far as to publish a fake genealogy, connecting him all the way back to the ancient heroes. There was not a more perfect candidate for Ferdowsi's new patron. By this point, Ferdowsi had changed. Physically, his hair whitened, his eyes grew dim, and he had a hard time standing up. His estate was criminally in debt still, and he could barely support himself. He had now been writing for so long, he couldn't remember much else. There was little difference between the man and the manuscript. Obtaining a royal patron would mean survival for both him and the Shahnameh, and he had come too far and lost too much to back down now. Not wasting a moment, Ferdowsi filled his story with praise of Mahmud. After all, he had quite the competition because Mahmud's court contained over 400 poets. When Mahmoud exempted Tus from taxes due to a particularly bad harvest, Ferdowsi praised his generosity for pages. The Lord of China, the Lord of Sind, the Lord of Iranians and non-Iranians, the Lord of splendor and exalted aim, beyond the reach of calumny and blame, at whose voice crocodiles in water crack. In 1005, in the poet's 60s, he sent the second edition of the Shahnameh to Mahmoud for royal favor. Months passed, and still no reward came. Not even a recognition or a refusal. What else was missing? What more could he do? Ferdowsi could not have guessed at why Mahmoud affronted him, but historians have several theories. Mahmoud preferred mostly poems about himself and his achievements. The Shahnameh may have been viewed as an insult, as it did not place him at the center, but rather expected him to consider the great rulers of the past. In addition, Mahmud's crafted image had changed. To acquire territory and excuse his constant acts of aggression, he now painted himself as an Islamic warrior, purging the land of idolaters and heretics. His new minister, partially responsible for this, greatly favored Arabic language and Islamic teaching. The Shahnameh was also unique from other histories of the time, in that it did not concern itself with the history of the Islamic prophets. It praises them, but still didn't look great to a monarch desperately trying to appear devoutly Islamic. Whatever the reason, Ferdowsi received no word for a year, until another messenger came with a very different message. At 37, Ferdowsi's son had passed away. Their strained relationship had come to an end. Horrified and enraged, Ferdowsi could not even remember his face. Now almost completely alone, without family, regretful, in ailing health, poor, and still so far from his goal of immortalizing the Iranian heroes, he beseeched Mahmoud again. This time, he filled his book with even more praise, and not so gently begged the king for money. Mahmoud was warring with the Indian states and had no time to read the work or hear it recited. Even more years passed, and still Ferdowsi received no word. A failure to them all. He had wasted his life doing this. Why had God kept him alive to see them all die? What else was there to say?